The Great Boston Molasses Flood of 1919, a river of sweet disaster. Boston's waterfront in January 1919 was deceptively calm. The North End, a tight-knit Italian immigrant neighborhood, bustled with factories and docks in the waning winter light. Towering over the streets stood an enormous 50-foot-tall steel tank filled with over 2 million gallons of dark, sticky molasses. Originally built in 1915, this tank was part of the booming wartime industry. Its sweet cargo was intended to be heated into industrial alcohol for munitions and fuel. Neighbors whispered about the strange noises and leaks. At night, the tank groaned under pressure and amber syrup often seeped through its rivets. Children even played around it, scooping up puddles of the leaked molasses. But when little Giuseppe Iantosca complained about the drips, he soon learned that U.S. Industrial Alcohol was a powerful company and poor immigrants had little influence. On the afternoon of January 15th, the air suddenly changed. A distant roar shattered the silence as if a machine gun had snapped off nearby. For a terrifying moment, Boston's North End stood frozen in disbelief. Then the unimaginable happened. The giant molasses tank exploded. In the war-weary years of 1919, industry was still booming. United States Industrial Alcohol (USAA) had become the East Coast's top buyer of imported molasses, using it to produce ethanol for the war effort. With World War I just ended and Prohibition looming, the company seized one final chance at profit. They filled the massive tank on Commercial Street with molasses, hoping to distill it into liquor before the ban on alcohol took effect. The tank itself was a marvel of haste. Overseer Arthur Gell had it built in record time amidst the crowded North End, 50 feet high and 90 feet across. To factory owners, it symbolized progress and prosperity. To local residents, it was an enigma casting a long, ominous shadow over their daily lives. Almost from the day it was filled, the great tank seemed ominously alive. Residents heard low rumblings from within its walls, and on warm days amber molasses oozed from the seams. Thin rivers of sticky syrup ran down the steel and pooled at the base, where neighborhood children eagerly gathered it as a sweet treat. Meanwhile, Isaac Gonzalez, the night watchman, began to dread each shift. He had seen the leaks, and every strange creak haunted his sleep. He even bolted into the streets at midnight during the summer of 1918, running barefoot through the snow to make sure the tank still stood. All these warning signs were met with silence from the owners. The tank's managers dismissed the fears. They were too busy meeting production quotas in the post-war boom. The North End community, mostly poor immigrants with little political clout, could only pray nothing would happen. On the morning of January 15, 1919, Boston experienced a sudden thaw. Overnight the temperature rose above 40 degrees Fahrenheit, melting snow and ice. By daylight, workers aboard the nearby docks were hauling a new hot shipment of molasses to the tank. The freshly heated syrup, meant to make pumping easier, was poured in that morning. Unseen by the onlookers, this was dangerous. The old, cold molasses already in the tank would rapidly expand as it heated. In effect, the new warm molasses put unbearable stress on the already strained walls of the container. In the hours before noon, the tank's steel groaned faintly, but the workers paid it no mind. They too, like everyone else, had no idea what disaster was brewing. By midday, the pressure inside the tank reached a breaking point. Suddenly, without any visible external trigger, the steel shell split. Commuters and factory workers on Commercial Street heard a deafening sound, described by many as a thunderous roar or even distant gunfire. Molasses shot out through every ruptured seam. Nearby, a man at the railroad turned to see rivets flying from the tank, and later recalled it sounded like machine gun fire as the metal tore apart. In an instant, the day turned to chaos. It was over in moments, but what followed was epic. A towering brown wave surged forth, 15 to 30 feet high in most accounts, and in some stories up to 40 feet. The 2.3 million gallons of molasses barreled down Commercial Street at roughly 35 miles per hour. Cars, wagons, and even streetcars were thrown off their tracks like toys. Nearby buildings exploded outward under the pressure. An elevated train track groaned and bent like aluminum, collapsing under the impact. In seconds, what had been a quiet winter afternoon was transformed into a catastrophic scene of debris and mud-colored floodwaters. The North End had become a war zone of sweet destruction. The consequences were heartbreaking. People were swept off their feet by the sticky torrent and thrown into walls, into piles of rubble, or sucked into basements. As one newspaper grimly reported, there was no escape from the wave. Most of those who died from suffocation. Once the molasses touched a victim's skin or clothing, they were often unable to free themselves. Breath became a battle. Victims gasped as the thick syrup filled their nostrils and mouths. Survivors struggled in vain, trying to wipe off the adhesive liquid even as panic set in. In that instant, ordinary people, laborers, streetcar workers, children, faced a new and unthinkable terror, and many could not outrun it. When the wave subsided, a horrible quiet fell. The rescuers arrived, police, firemen, Red Cross volunteers, and even sailors from the nearby USS Nantucket, many chest deep in sticky molasses. Survivors later said they had barely heard anything before the disaster, just a faint tremor and then the blast. In the ruins lay victims still alive and many others not. Newspaper accounts later described the scene: the dead, dying, suffocating, struggling and maimed mass of humanity and animals, stretched out on the street, not all discovered until hours later. Stretcher after stretcher arrived at makeshift aid stations, carrying what reporters called molasses-dripping humanity. Nurses' white uniforms were smeared chocolate brown as they waded through the floodwaters to bring the injured to safety. Family members ran from one hospital to another, terror in their eyes. It was pitiful beyond description, one witness wrote, as anxious mothers and fathers searched for lost loved ones among the confusion. Among the 21 who lost their lives were many ordinary families. 10-year-old Pasquale Iantosca was home early from school, gathering firewood by the tank. His father, Giuseppe, watched from the second-story window in a crimson sweater. In an instant, Pasquale was gone, swallowed by a dark wall of molasses. Giuseppe searched frantically for hours, heartbroken. When he finally returned home, his wife Maria was waiting at the doorway, tearful. He had come home alone, a contemporary report later noted, a sentence that said everything. Pasquale's body was recovered days later, his small arms and crimson sweater slick with molasses. Nearby, the Clougherty family suffered another kind of loss. Martin Clougherty, a stonecutter, was asleep in his home on Commercial Street when the deluge hit. He awoke to the house collapsing around him. Martin managed to pull himself free and even pulled his sister to safety, but their mother was crushed under the falling debris. In the following months, Martin's older brother Stephen, a veteran of the flu pandemic, never recovered from his trauma and would die in a hospital the next year. These victims were not public figures or wealthy magnates. They were immigrants, laborers, and everyday people. As historian Stephen Puleo later wrote, no prominent people were killed in the molasses flood. The survivors did not go on to become famous. They were mostly immigrants and city workers who returned to their workday lives. In other words, the tragedy belonged to ordinary Boston families, each with their own grief and silence after that day. As evening fell, the neighborhood showed its strength. Police officers and firemen waded waist-high through the ooze, forging a path to pull victims from collapsed walls and basements. Cadets from the USS Nantucket sprinted off their ship to help, handing stretchers and carrying buckets of water to clean wounds. Every able-bodied person pitched in: store clerks, dock workers, parishioners. Trains of ambulances ferried injured people to the hospital. Every mattress and blanket in local schools was pressed into emergency service. By nightfall, dozens of people had been rescued by these makeshift rescue teams, often at great personal risk. Even as tears ran freely, those heroes' courage shone. For example, 6 city streetcar workers who had been eating lunch were among the victims, and their co-workers never hesitated to help search for their bodies. The North End community would later remember how neighbors and strangers alike acted with extraordinary bravery amid the brown flood. When rescue gave way to recovery, the mess proved formidable. In the cold air, the spilled molasses had turned into a gluey sludge that coated every surface. Fire hoses blasted seawater from the harbor into streets, forcing the molasses through sewers. Early on, engineers discovered that salt water broke down the molasses most effectively. Day after day, crews shoveled and hosed away the brown layer from brick sidewalks and stairways. Even in the docks, the tide turned brown as the harbor water was used in cleanup. In some narrow alleys, molasses sat knee-deep, requiring men and horses to wade through it to clear the way. Local bakeries were closed until the sticky residue could be scraped clean. Remarkably, this cleanup lasted well into spring. For months after the flood, the city continued to remove globs of hardened molasses from its streets and buildings. Within days, investigators arrived to determine the cause. Civil engineers inspected the wreckage and found the tank's walls shockingly thin for its height and volume. Workmen and witnesses pointed out that the steel plates had leaked from the very beginning. The tank had bulged and groaned long before it failed. Together with the weather data, the sharp warm-up that day, the conclusion was inescapable: hasty construction and shoddy design had doomed the tank. However, before admitting negligence, USAA executives spread wild rumors that an anarchist bomb had destroyed the tank, a nod to the era's Red Scare atmosphere. There was no evidence of any explosion. Every sign pointed back to negligence and ignored warnings. Families of the victims demanded justice. By early 1920, 119 separate claims were filed against USIA. The courtroom saga dragged on for years, involving lawyers and judges weighing complex engineering evidence. Eventually, in 1925, a Massachusetts jury found USIA fully responsible. The company was ordered to pay about $628,000, over $9 million today, in damages to the victims' families. Judge Hugh Ogden, a World War I veteran in civilian robes, ruled that the disaster had been entirely preventable. USIA executives, he noted, could not hide behind secrecy any longer. Though the money helped, no settlement could truly mend the broken hearts of those who had lost daughters, sons, and friends. One positive outcome of the flood was a change in safety laws. In 1920, Massachusetts passed some of the nation's first strict regulations for industrial tanks and ships. Engineers now had to prove on paper that a tank could hold far more than its contents, and inspectors were empowered to conduct surprise safety tests. These new standards quickly spread beyond Boston. Across the country, cities cited the Molasses disaster as a warning, adopting tougher building codes for tanks and silos. The gloomy lessons of January 1919 thus saved lives in decades to come. Boston's naval yards and oil depots were redesigned with this in mind. Engineers frankly admitted that, thanks to the Molasses flood, they would never again build a waterfront container without ensuring every rivet was double-checked. For many years, Boston treated the event as a bizarre footnote. A small bronze plaque now marks the site on Commercial Street, describing the 40-foot wave of molasses that once crushed buildings and buckled railroad tracks. The city grew and changed. Most descendants of the survivors eventually melted back into daily life. A tourist guidebook might chuckle about the scent of molasses locals joked about on hot days, a folklore echoing brown sugar and blood, described in the old newspaper. But in recent decades, the flood has resurfaced in public memory as a cautionary tale. Historians and community leaders emphasize its deeper lessons. The tragedy highlights corporate negligence versus worker safety, the struggles of immigrant communities, and the unsung heroism of ordinary Bostonians. Each January, commemorations and tours remind new generations that this was not just a funny story, but a serious disaster that reshaped the city. One writer observed that the Molasses flood had become part of the city's folklore, but not its heritage. By retelling these events in full, we honor both. The 21 people who died were husbands, wives, sons, and daughters. The responders were fathers and firefighters with quiet courage. It is their faces, not just the flowing syrup, that we will remember. In this cinematic journey through history, we see how a seemingly sweet substance turned into a deadly force, and how a community rose out of tragedy. From a frozen January day in 1919, the story of the Great Molasses Flood continues to teach us about the strength of ordinary people and the importance of accountability.